Games that don't push the limits of the Super NES. That's what this is. I don't mean bad games necessarily. I'm not talking about games that don't push the limits just because they're terrible. No, I mean games that don't use the system's full capabilities for different, more interesting reasons. Let me give you a concrete example and start out with Mr. Do. A very late home version of the arcade game from 1982, released in 1995, and that's really all this is, an accurate port of the arcade game. I don't think this can be emulation. It's close to the original, but it's not identical. It isn't, though, a remake, a remaster, or whatever. It's an attempt to bring the arcade game to the Super NES accurately. That includes the graphics, which are much less sophisticated than what the Super NES can usually handle. The resolution is the same, but Mr. Do's graphics have a maximum of 4 colours in 8x8 pixel tile, as opposed to the Super NES's usual 16. It's also got a smaller number of total colours on screen and a much smaller overall colour palette too than what the Super NES is usually capable of. To keep it authentic, they dialed back on the technical quality. It's obviously very common now for games to have retro-style graphics, but it was almost unheard of back then. In fact, this release is probably amongst the very first wave of retro gaming and acknowledgement of gaming's past. They could have made the graphics better, but they didn't. Ms. Pac-Man, another arcade classic, ported to the Super NES by Williams, does it differently, going for a more 90s, updated look and new mazes. Mr. Do, though, keeps it looking like 1982 and weirdly is quite forward-thinking for doing so. It's not the only SNES game to take this approach. There's also Galaxy Wars, another game originally from Japanese arcade developer Universal, and again ported to the Super NES by Imagineer, same as Mr. Do. This, though, is an even more minimalist game, a sort of cross between Frogger and Space Invaders, though it came out before Frogger in 1979. And this is a very deep cut, not just as it's a Japanese exclusive Super NES port, but the original arcade machine too. I'm more into old arcade games than most, but I had never heard of it until I discovered this version. Although designed by Universal, it was manufactured by Taito, the Space Invaders creators, and yes, the original arcade hardware is basically the same. So it's even less technically advanced than Mr. Do, and whilst there's a Neo mode you can play with more Super NES era graphics on display, the super old school arcade recreations have got to be amongst the least impressive graphics you could ever hope to find on the Super NES. Completely black and white 1-bit per pixel monochrome is surely very, very old school. The only other thing on the Super NES that goes this low has to be Space Invaders. Yes, this is Taito's own port of their era-defining arcade game, and it goes hard on authenticity too. Here again, there are a few different modes you can play, including one that recreates the printed backdrop from the original upright machine, but there's also this cocktail cabinet version, which is pure black and white minimalism. There's not even a status bar here. This is basically as primitive as graphics get. It follows then that these games are all amongst the smallest official Super NES games at 256 kilobytes each, or 2 megabits. There were a few games this size and no official ones were ever any smaller, even including all the very weird formats the Super NES saw in its life. The Sufami Turbo mini cartridges, the Satellaview satellite system, the Nintendo Power cartridge, nothing to do with the magazine, but Nintendo's official flash cart from the very late 90s. These all had exclusive games, but none were smaller than 4 megabits. Can we find a smaller Super NES game? Can we get even less going on than these old arcade ports? I thought maybe the Super NES version of Space Invaders that comes on the Game Boy Space Invaders cartridge and is playable through the Super Game Boy might have a smaller file size, but it doesn't seem to. It looks like there's again 256 kilobytes of Super NES data on there from what I can find poking around in the ROM. We can maybe find a smaller individual game though by looking at a multi-game cartridge. This is Arcade's Greatest Hits, the Atari collection, released by Midway in 1997. This is 6 remade Atari arcade games that all fit on a 512 or 4 megabit cartridge. 512 divided by 6 equals about 85 kilobytes each, but I feel like it might not be quite so simple. I don't know for certain, but some of these games might reuse code to make each one actually larger than that when you take the whole thing together. Asteroids here though gives Space Invaders a good run for its money when it comes to sheer graphical simplicity on the Super NES. Not a bad game, not at all, a respectable version of the seminal arcade classic, but a bit less than what we know the Super NES for. The other games on here aren't really any more graphically impressive either, well, except possibly Battlezone. Yes, it's still fully monochrome, a recreation of the wireframe vector graphics of the arcade original, but it is 3D and the frame rate is pretty good too. This is one that I missed in my recent Super NES 3D video somehow, but the frame rate is honestly better than any other 3D game on this system, including Super FX enhanced games, so well done to that one on Midway, although the absolute simplicity of the graphics may have played a part in it. But wait a moment, let me interrupt here for a quick word from our sponsor for this video, Fume. Fume is a flavoured air device that helps you fill the void left behind when you ditch your bad habits, giving you something satisfying to reach for instead of a vape or whatever. It's nicotine free, it's vapor free, there's no battery, no charging, it works right out of the box, but it does have some really great flavours with natural ingredients. There's minty flavours, fruity flavours, and well, it might not be for everyone, but there's also maple pepper that might just hit the spot for you. Fume isn't magic, it's not going to eliminate your bad habits, but it can help by giving you an alternative with a satisfying feel. It's clicky, it's tactile, and the toppers that you can get with your kit are a nice addition too. Go to tryfume.com/Chiropolis or scan the QR code and use code Chiropolis to get your free Fume topper when you order your journey pack today. So thank you, Fume, but let's go on with the quest to find smaller Super NES games because it might lead somewhere interesting, and the only place we can look now is the world of homebrew and other unofficial releases, and that will reveal this Tic Tac Toe. At just short of 16 kilobytes, this is the smallest complete working game I could find, and yes, it is just tic-tac-toe, or noughts and crosses as we call it in the UK, but it does have quite a nice soundtrack, and it's even got an AI opponent to play with 3 difficulty levels, though I suspect the soundtrack may be stolen from somewhere else, I don't know. Created by someone just calling themselves Amos, not only is this the smallest Super NES game I could find, but it is also, I strongly suspect, the very first homebrew game on the system. I don't know exactly when it came out, but this is an early version of a slightly more deluxe final release that came out in February 1993, so it is sometime before that. Extremely impressive considering that this predates the first Super NES emulators and even the World Wide Web, really. How on earth was this made? It must have been run on the real hardware and be based on a lot of hard-won reverse engineering. The creator's email address in this game's README file has a Hong Kong country code, and that might give us a bit of a clue because that was the centre of development for disc copiers. The forerunner of the modern flash cartridge, which loads copies of games' ROM files from floppy disk rather than an SD card, and saw quite a big scene around it, not just pirate copies of commercial games, but also lots of homebrew development too. It was probably one of these that was used to get Tic Tac Toe working, and it's from that scene that this next game comes from too. It's baseball. Yes, just baseball, that's what it's called. Released 30 years ago in 1995, and it's what appears to be a port of the NES game from 1983. It's slightly glitchy, there's no sound, but it does play okay, and at about 26 kilobytes is the second smallest functional Super NES game I can find. There's something a bit odd about this though. Who did this port and how are the questions that spring to mind. It's attributed to a group called Anthrax, big on the Super NES disc copier scene in the 90s. That's one question out of the way, I suppose, but is this a translated port? Some sort of emulation? A quick look into the ROM file gives us a clue. Yes, hidden here there's this header, FC emulator, M Kamiyama. Yeah, this seems like Anthrax might have been taking credit for someone else's work, but hey, they were a cracking crew. Distributing pirate software is what they do. But FC emulator, what is that? Well, there's so little information about this online, just a couple of vague references on ancient websites. If there's a Super NES iceberg, this is surely at the bottom of it. I'm pretty sure though this isn't actually an emulator in the strict sense of the word. The ROM file that this game runs from is too small for it to be that, but it is some sort of tool that automatically patches NES ROMs into Super NES compatible games, auto-porting them though, leaving them completely silent. What bits of information I've been able to tease out about this suggest that it only works with a few select NES games below a certain size, the very earliest ones pretty much, and nothing else, and it relies on the fact that the NES have not the same but compatible CPUs. Anthrax went on to release quite a few of these ports in the mid-90s, most of them dressed up a bit more than baseball, which must have been the first they released. Later ones have intros and some sort of soundtrack, though the games themselves are often very glitchy. Baseball must have been about the best running game they could find. In more recent times though, this same idea has been resurrected by Project Nested, something I did a video about a while ago. This is an actual NES emulator on the Super NES, though it does still require some pre-processing, and it works extremely well. It doesn't have anything like total compatibility, but it runs a lot of NES games basically perfectly on the Super NES. The end result is still converted ROM files in Super NES format that you can run on an emulator or flashcart, but they are much larger than the FC emulator converted ROMs, and they basically have the emulator integrated into the ROM file. Just like Anthrax did with M. Kamiyama's work, whoever that was, lots of people are distributing these converted NES games online without giving credit to Project Nested and its very talented creator. For the full info, have a look at the official GitHub page or my old video, which is a bit outdated but does have more in-depth info. None of these games come close to what the Super NES is capable of course, that was the whole point of the Super NES. It can do stuff that the original can't, but the method required to get these games running does definitely push the limits. Just to get really meta for a moment, here is a game I featured on my other video, games that don't push the limits of the NES. This is a very disappointing port of Yar's Revenge to the NES for the crappy original Atari Flashback, which just turned out to be a cheap NES clone, but, well, this is it, running on the Super NES via Project Nested. This version was disappointing because the NES can't display as many colours on screen as the Atari 2600, so this version looks quite dull, except of course the Super NES can display that many colours, but anyway, let's move on to another very small Super NES game, one that's got nothing to do with the NES, it's Qwak. If you know your retro systems, you'll probably recognise this right away as a game that looks suspiciously like another 8-bit system, the C64, and this is a port of the C64 game Qwak, which itself was developed to fit on a 16KB C64 cartridge. The Super NES version isn't quite so small. The latest version with music and effects is a bit bigger, but still quite compact. The look is totally C64, but this isn't any kind of emulation or direct port. It's been rewritten by Aussie Phantom for the Super NES, and a fine job they have done of it too. It's a fun game though, of course very old school, and it's a bit of a novelty to see the C64 style graphics on the Super NES. For games like this that use the C64's character-based modes, it is going to be fairly easy to fit that into the Super NES's tile-based graphics. Anything that relies more on the C64's bitmap modes could be a bit more difficult, but maybe not impossible, I don't know. I love this though, it's a fun game, nowhere near a bad one, but wow, less than what the Super NES can usually be relied upon to do. This isn't though the end of C64 madness on the Super NES, oh no, there is more where this came from. Not remotely recent, but another relic from the depths of the 90s, let's take a look at the Commodore 64 game collection. Yes, this is a thing indeed, a selection of 10 C64 games ported to the Super NES, all in one handy ROM file. Sadly, this isn't quite the best the system has to offer, no Turrican or Last Ninja, but some very early C64 games. All of them pretty small in terms of file size, and none of them actually that good, but hey, you've got to admire the spirit behind this. Created by Image, an otherwise very obscure demo group from Finland, they did have a bit of form with this sort of thing. Previously they had brought games from the VIC-20 and NES to the PC Engine, so C64 games on the Super NES must have been the next logical step. I can honestly tell you nothing about the origin of this at all, there's just no information online. It is an enigma. I suspect these days no one knows anything about this, even the creators themselves have probably long forgotten what the hell they were thinking at the time. I do know that the game collections on the PC Engine works really surprisingly well, but this less so, with the games as rendered here being even choppier and glitchier than the originals, and the originals were already pretty choppy and glitchy. There's also the resolution to deal with. The low-res, high-colour mode of the C64 fits fine into the Super NES's screen resolution, but these games use the higher-res mode, which is wider than what the Super NES can handle. On here then, these games therefore have to scroll using the shoulder buttons on the controller, which sort of works but is a bit annoying. They have at least all been hacked so that they start and control with the standard buttons on the controller, so they are at least fully playable if you want to. As for how this works, well, I really don't know, but hidden in the ROM file is a string identifying it as a C64 emulator, but whether this is really an emulator or more like a load of ports, I couldn't tell you right now. It is definitely a weird curio though, and if anyone out there does know anything more about this strange collection, well, do let me know. But I think we're getting close to the end now. There's more Super NES weirdness I could cover, but for the moment I'm going to call halt on this one. I really got lost in weird ports in this video, didn't I? But there is more to the Super NES than that, but I think this could be a topic that I will come back to. For now though, thanks as always to my wonderful Patreons. Please, if you feel like you could, do join them. There is a link below and it does help me out. And I will say thanks for watching and goodbye. But just before I do disappear, another shout out to Fume for sponsoring this video. Thank you so much, Fume. Check out the link in the description or use the QR code with code Chiropolis. And I will say once again goodbye to you all.